Watching the You're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Coming up, another delay for the government's energy strategy amid reports of a cabinet split over the cost of nuclear power. The future for consumers looks difficult, with energy bills set to rise to their highest level in more than 60 years. And a breakthrough moment for the airline industry. British Airways announces it's using sustainable jet fuel produced at scale in the UK. Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show, where we track the changes happening to our world, hear from the people being hit hardest by those changes, and report on the race for solutions. Now, the war in Ukraine has changed everything. The effects of that conflict are playing out in ways which no one could have predicted before the invasion. With much of the West now trying to reduce its dependency on Russian oil and gas, many countries, including the UK, are grappling with how to secure long-term supplies of energy. And while we await a government strategy for energy supplies, there's a renewed focus on nuclear power. With the proportion of nuclear in our electricity mix slowly declining, the Prime Minister says he wants a quarter of all our electricity to be from nuclear in future. Our science and technology editor, Tom Clark, reports from North Wales.
In their day, the two reactors at Trawsfynydd made enough power for a city the size of Manchester. This plant shut down 30 years ago, but some of its core components will be radioactive for centuries. The remaining waste is being boxed up for long-term storage.
What you can see here is concrete boxes, inside which there's another box, and inside that there's what's called intermediate level waste. So this is what you see as waste that's come from half a century of nuclear generation.
For a long time, the assumption was these sites would be effectively forgotten. But the energy crisis means they're being eyed as the best places for a nuclear renaissance.
Our job as Magnox is to decommission the site and do that in a safe and sustainable way to enable this site to be reused and regenerated for whatever use we all decide is needed here.
At a peak in 1997, 15 power plants produced more than a quarter of the UK's electricity. But by 2024, only 3 will still be generating. And by 2030, there'll be just 2, Sizewell B and the long-delayed Hinkley C in Somerset. Last week, at a number 10 roundtable, the Prime Minister said he wanted 25% of our energy to come from nuclear once again. Executives from Rolls-Royce were there, trying to persuade him of a new approach: small modular reactors.
We've designed this solution in order to ensure we've got a much more robust route to market with a technology that can be financed with private capital and that has, by design, a product that is lower cost and can be built in a factory.
Best case scenario, worst case scenario, I don't know, when do you think we'll see?
Well, hopefully, if you come and speak to me in a year's time, we'll be in the middle of those negotiations.
Rolls-Royce's reactor is based on its designs used in nuclear submarines. To make SMRs faster and less complex to build, they'll be prefabricated in modules.
So this is an example of a module.
Right.
So the SMR,
one component of the reactor.
One module. So this is modular constructed, so it's built in a factory environment, taken to site, and then modules assembled together. So you're taking all that risk out of the construction.
While investment risks may be lower, SMRs still need to be proven in the real world. They'll face stiff competition from rival bids for bigger nuclear plants, and neither is a quick fix for the energy crisis or the challenge of net zero.
It's right, perhaps, that the government has nuclear as part of its strategy. I certainly expect that it would do that. But it's quite wrong to think that we can get nuclear in time, new nuclear in time, for next winter, the winter after that, or in fact for many years.
To some, sites like this are the legacy of an expensive and messy chapter in our energy history. To others, they're monuments to an era of high-tech, homegrown, zero-carbon electricity, reminding us how short-term thinking can end up costing us more in the long run. Tom Clark, Sky News, North Wales.
Well, the government was due to announce its long-awaited energy supply strategy this week. That, however, has been delayed again. So let's bring in Tom Clark, who we just heard from. And Tom, when you were telling us there about the possible role of nuclear power in the future, but what about the rest of the strategy? And why haven't we heard yet from the government?
It's a remarkable delay, and this is something, given the urgency of the energy crisis, that we were hoping to get quite speedily. I think the Prime Minister wants to get it through. The understanding is there's a split over nuclear. The cost of nuclear power has been a big deterrent to people in the Treasury. And you can see why. The only nuclear power station we're building at the moment, Hinkley C, has gone massively over budget. £23 billion it's projected to cost. That's making it possibly the most expensive energy project ever put on the face of the earth. And you can see why they don't want to repeat that. The nuclear industry, as you saw in my report there, lobbying the Prime Minister, we can do things better, we can do them cheaper, we can reduce those risks. But the costs are high, and nuclear isn't going to deliver immediate reductions in our dependency on fossil fuels, which is what that strategy needs to do. But in the absence of lots of short-term options, it's certainly something that the government needs to consider, as well as our commitments to net zero, of course, and nuclear power is a source of net zero electricity too. Now, if you put those things into the mix and the extreme expense, the cost, the fossil fuel price rises at the moment, actually makes nuclear look reasonably affordable. And it's sort of a lack of long-term thinking that you could argue put us in this situation in the first place. The thing that some people prefer is maybe we continue burning gas as an energy security priority, but to mitigate the fossil fuel risk, we use carbon capture and storage to bury the carbon dioxide. But interestingly, the Treasury axed a £1 billion pot of money back in 2015 for that. So a lesson there about this long-term thinking when it comes to energy security, which we've maybe missed in the past. That's certainly what the nuclear industry will be trying to persuade the government of at the moment.
Tom, thanks very much indeed. And we'll actually be discussing all of this, energy security and more broadly how the war in Ukraine has affected our net zero strategy, with founder and director of Terra Praxis, Kirsty Gogan, and Professor of Political Economy at the University of Sheffield, Michael Jacobs. That's a little later. But now let's take a look at some of the day's other climate news. And British Airways has become the first airline to use sustainable aviation fuel produced on a commercial scale in the UK. Sustainable aviation fuel production reduces carbon emissions by around 80% compared with traditional jet fuel, but is currently more expensive. British Airways parent group IAG has a target of powering 10% of all flights with sustainable fuel by 2030. UK farmers could soon be paying hundreds of millions of pounds more a year for fertiliser as Russia's invasion of Ukraine continues to hit supply chains. In 2020, the UK imported more than 22,000 tonnes of fertiliser from Russia, one of the world's largest producers. The Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit says a handful of British companies are leading the way in developing net zero fertilisers, and that could help to start cut Britain's dependence on Russia. National Grid has sold a 60% stake in its gas network to a group of global investors in a move it says will make the network ready for the transition to net zero by 2050. The deal with the consortium is reported to be worth £2.2 billion, and National Grid says it will help the business pivot towards electricity. Now, the energy price cap is set to rise at the end of this week, with the war in Ukraine making an already difficult energy supply situation even more complicated. It's inevitable that prices will rise again in the autumn. So let's take a look at our data dashboard and we can see how much we rely on gas. I mean, today in particular, there's a low output from renewables, so well over half of our electricity is coming from gas, 57% there. Our economics editor, Ed Conway, has been taking a look at what we can expect.
The Bank of England governor says we could be facing a historic squeeze on our incomes as a result of the energy crisis.
The shock from energy prices this year will be larger than any single year in the 1970s.
So larger than any single year in the 1970s. Actually, that could be a bit of an understatement, and I'll show you why in a second. But first of all, let's have a look at those energy prices. So this is gas prices, wholesale gas prices that your supplier is potentially paying, going back to the last year. Now, you'll remember, in December, we thought that level that it hit there, that peak there, was high. Well, it was high, it was unprecedented. But look at what happened after the invasion of Ukraine. It went up to crazy levels, really, incredibly high levels. It has come down a bit since then, so down a bit, still high, but down a bit. Why is that? It's partly because contrary to what you might have thought, actually, there is quite a lot of Russian gas still flowing to the EU. In fact, more than before the invasion. Just look at that line. It's higher than before the invasion, the highest level that we've seen so far this year. So there's a lot going on here, but it's worth just picking apart what that means for our bills and how much of our income we pay on them. And I can show you this line goes all the way back to the 1950s. The blue area there is the kind of range, the share of our expenditure that's going on our energy. And you can see it's actually been relatively low in recent decades. But look at what happens at the end of this week, at the start of April, when that price cap comes in. So that's just under £2,000, highest level since the mid-1980s as a result of that. But the question now is what happens next. And in October, the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, they said last week, they do the official forecast for the government, they said potentially a price cap of £2,800. And just to put that into perspective, look at that red line. That is higher, so the share of what we're paying, the share of our expenditure that's going on it, higher than we've ever seen before. The 70s, but also the 60s, also a lot of the 50s as well. Now, bear in mind, you've got to factor in the fact that you've got that £350 in a council tax cut, rebates that are coming through from the government. So you bear that in mind. But even after you do that, look, that red line's still above those levels that peaks that we've seen going back to the 1950s. However, as I showed you a moment ago, those prices are yo-yoing around quite a lot at the moment. So every single day, that calculation changes. Right now, it's not looking like £2,800. It's looking more like, this is the latest forecast, more like £2,490. So lower, but still the red line above anything we've paid before as a share of our incomes. But here, again, you've got to do that calculation. So bear in mind what the government's doing, £350, take that off, and we're down to, well, it's not the highest level since the mid-80s, it's the highest level since the early 80s. Even so, we're talking about a historic thing going on here, maybe even tougher than what the Bank of England governor was talking about.
Now, businesses wanting to sell bugs as food in the UK have warned they're in limbo because of the lack of a post-Brexit agreement for the sector. Insects are a sustainable, low-carbon source of protein and have been promoted as a future solution to food scarcity and the climate crisis. A trade body representing edible insect businesses hopes that a decision from the Food Standards Agency will give them blanket approval to trade from June. Do stay with us. Coming up, I'll be joined by founder and director of TerraPraxis, Kirsty Gogan, and Michael Jacobs, Professor of Political Economy from the University of Sheffield. And we're going to be discussing what the war in Ukraine means for the race to net zero and if the nuclear power could be the answer to the energy crisis.
The wind was like pulling us out of that little room.
Mandatory evacuation, you must leave!
I'm Greg Milam, Sky's US correspondent here in Los Angeles. It is almost impossible to predict where these fires will go next. We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news. This gives you an idea of the strength of those winds, strong enough to bend and twist metal. You trying to run me over, Sir Philip?
No, go away.
Look like it, sir. Will you respond to those who made accusations, Sir Philip?
Can you go away?
I've seen the dark side of America. We are standing on the supply line right into the heart of America's opioid crisis. I've seen heartbreaking human stories.
There was a river of blood coming out of the mosque. That's a scene that you don't forget.
Christchurch has been changed forever by what happened here.
Hello and welcome back to the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Now, we're getting straight to discussing the climate issues of the day now with founder and director of Terra Praxis, Kirsty Gogan, and Professor of Political Economy at the University of Sheffield, Michael Jacobs. So a very good evening to both of you. Nice to see you both. So, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has changed everything. For the people of Ukraine, of course, for Russians where economic sanctions are beginning to bite, and for Europe and Western allies who are working out how to deal with Vladimir Putin. And the question I'd like to ask is, where does this leave international climate strategy and the race to net zero? So, Michael Jacobs, has the war in Ukraine affected our chances of meeting net zero, do you think, as the UK and its neighbours as well, of course, learns to wean itself off Russian oil and gas?
Well, I think that very much depends upon the nature of the commitments that governments make. They are trying now to get themselves off Russian oil and gas, as you say, and initially that won't have much of or that won't make much of an impact on climate change targets. They're going to try and get oil and gas from other countries. But the longer term transition, I think, has been, or at least could be, speeded up. We know that the best way of getting ourselves off gas and oil in general is to shift to renewable energy and to stop wasting energy, what we often call energy efficiency. And those things could be accelerated. Many people, and I would be one of them, would argue that our energy security and our climate security are essentially the same thing. And I would now add our national security if we consider the dangers that a Putin-led Russia holds for the West. So I do think it's possible that we could see the impact of Ukraine long term as an acceleration of the shift towards net zero. But it still does depend on the decisions which governments make, including our own.
Well, yes, and we'll hear more about that strategy in the days ahead. But Kirsty, in the meantime, Michael, they're relatively optimistic about what the future could hold in terms of net zero. But some people will say, isn't it inevitable that the government's going to say, let's increase domestic North Sea oil and gas production, at least in the short term, to replace the Russian oil and gas that we're weaning ourselves off?
Yeah, that is a big risk. And it's, even a big risk that we might, decide to delay the closure of our coal plants, even, in light of this crisis. But I think actually more broadly, these terrible recent events have prompted a major rethink in terms of our, overdependence, really the folly of overdependence on imported gas, both in terms of, price stability, as well as energy security. And, I think governments across Europe are actually beginning now to look again at nuclear energy alongside renewables and energy efficiency, because actually all of the evidence tells us that although nuclear plants appear to be quite slow to be built, once they are built, they are very, very large. So in terms of the overall contribution that they make towards adding very reliable, very stably priced and very clean electricity generation to our grids, they're in fact the fastest way to decarbonize our electricity grids, as has been demonstrated previously in many countries, including Sweden and France.
And I want to pick up with nuclear again in a moment, but first, just a quick thought again on domestic oil and gas, Michael Jacobs. I mean, the people who say, do that now, it's going to be quicker and easier to do it now to increase North Sea oil production. We've got our own domestic supply that way. It's a short-term fix. It's got kind of gives us this base load of secure energy into the mix where renewables have more vagaries.
Well, we can discuss the intermittency question and the role of nuclear in a second. But in terms of North Sea oil and gas, we need to be very careful about saying that it's a short-term fix. It takes, on average, 28 years to move from the beginning, the exploration process for a new oil or gas field, and actually oil and gas coming on stream. Now, that's an average. But of course, if it took 28 years, that would take us to 2050. And 2050 is the year that we're meant to be net zero. So it's not a short-term solution. Even if a new oil and gas field could come on stream in 15 years, this is still a very long time. And what we have is an immediate requirement to move away from Russian oil and gas. So it's not a short-term fix, that at all. And of course, it may well be that because we are on a generally declining trend of gas and oil towards our net zero targets, that the private sector decides that it doesn't want to invest in new fields because it won't be able to sell all the oil and gas that will be found in them, and they will be left as so-called stranded assets. So I don't think new oil and gas fields in the North Sea is an answer to the current questions that we face.
And let's pick up on what Kirsty was saying, that nuclear is the answer. Do you think that's right? I mean, I know, Kirsty, you're, I think, advising the government on this subject, so you're a big fan of it. Michael, is nuclear the way forward?
Well, the advantage of nuclear is that it's baseload capacity. When the wind doesn't blow so much and the sun doesn't shine, we need electricity that is on all the time. And gas and coal-fired power stations have done that for us in the past, along with nuclear, and nuclear could do it in a low-carbon form in the future. The problem is the length of time it takes to build new nuclear power stations. Now, your report from Tom earlier talked about modular nuclear reactors, which is the new kind, which are untested yet, and we don't know how long they could come on stream. But we do know that the traditional large nuclear reactors take a very long time to come on stream. Hinkley Point C is due to come on stream in 2026, having first been granted planning permission in 2012.
OK, I'm going to pick those up.
Now, that is a very long time to wait before we will get that new capacity. And in the meantime, new storage technologies for electricity might well have proved themselves a better option.
Kirsty, let's pick up on those points then. It just takes way too long. We haven't got time, have we, with these net zero goals looming?
The thing is that, you know, it is quite quick to build a solar project, for example, but a solar project is 1,000 times smaller than a nuclear plant, and then only has a 10% capacity factor, which means it generates only 10% of its nameplate capacity. So that's why, even though these big nuclear plants do take a long time to come on board, once they're up and running, then they do represent a massive quantity of the electricity that we need. But I think I'd like to broaden this out a little bit and remember that we're actually, you know, only talking about 20% of our energy consumption right now, which is electricity. Actually, what we also need to remember is that we have to decarbonize the other 80% of our energy use, which means liquid fuels, which means industry, which means heavy transport, shipping, aviation. Those are really tough to decarbonize sectors. And one of the really big advantages for nuclear technologies that I'm really interested in is the fact that they can produce high temperature heat. Now, that's something that wind and solar can't do, but it means that they can produce very cost-effective hydrogen-based clean synthetic fuels and heat for industrial applications.
Yeah, and Kirsty, just one more thing on that very high heat. It's one of the reasons people get nervous about it. Look at the situation in Ukraine. People have concerns about the Chernobyl nuclear plant. For example, people worry about safety, don't they? And they worry about nuclear waste as well. So just touch on those issues if you can.
Yeah, I think we have to look at, you know, any of these kind of risks and in context. And, you know, right now, the reality is that we see 7 million premature deaths per year around the world, every single year from air pollution. So actually focusing on net zero and cleaning up all of our, you know, global fossil fuel-based energy infrastructure is a really incredible opportunity, not only to, you know, address the climate challenges that we face, but also the public health challenges that we face. And when you look at those risks and those, you know, real material effects that we're already experiencing today, before even the climate risks, you start to see that the risks presented by nuclear energy are very well managed indeed, and present a much smaller risk to public health and the environment.
And finally, very quickly, just to put to both of you, Michael, there's so many different aspects to this whole issue, but is there a way of getting prices down for consumers and it being good for the planet?
The best way of getting prices down for consumers or getting bills down is to invest in energy efficiency. We waste so much of our energy through our leaky buildings and our poor energy efficiency and insulation standards. And that's not only the cheapest method of meeting our energy needs, but is also the thing that will most bring bills down for householders. So I really want to see that as the centerpiece of the government's energy strategy whenever it comes.
Kirsty, a quick thought from you on the same subject.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Energy efficiency is critical. We have to do all of these things at once. We have to move forward in all fronts. 28 years to achieve net zero across our entire fossil fuel energy system. So we need a very ambitious energy strategy from the government, which does include, you know, investments in nuclear energy to deliver, you know, cost-effective and very stable and ultimately very secure, reliable energy.
Well, when we do get that strategy, it'd be really interesting to get your thoughts on it. But for the moment, thanks very much indeed, both of you, for joining us. Kirsty Gogan, Michael Jacobs, we appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, that's it from us for today. But joining me on the show tomorrow are Chief Executive at Forum for the Future, Dr. Sally Uren, and Executive Director of Climate Outreach, Jamie Clark. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.